Over the last few weeks, we've seen how a writer's personal life can become intertwined with their public life, how their writings, which is the expression of their private self, can be reactive to the events of their day. As Hegel said, artists belong to their own times and customs, and this is certainly true for the poet we're focusing on this week. This poet served a very public role as a senator in the Oireachtas, the Irish Parliament, and was inexorably linked to the political turmoil of his day. The poet in question is William Butler Yeats, and this presentation will examine his part in the literary and political life of revolutionary Ireland. We'll begin the history by painting a picture of the environment into which Yeats was born. Ireland in 1865 is still a part of the United Kingdom, though increasingly dissatisfied by growing political repression. Catholics are still heavily persecuted in Parliament. They're all but disenfranchised until 1829. And following the potato famines of the 1840s, where the bulk of the economic hardships fell on the Catholic working class, there was a rising faction within Ireland, especially among the Catholic majority, that favored secession and self-governance and a transfer of power away from the Protestant land-owning ruling class. We make this distinction between Catholic and Protestant because it defines much of the political turmoil between Ireland and Britain throughout the 19th century. For a brief example of this, we need to look no further than the aforementioned potato famines. While Irish Catholic farmers were working the soil, the farms themselves were owned mostly by wealthy Protestants, many of whom didn't even live in Ireland, but collected money from the Irish economy all the same, without giving anything back. This sentiment was reflected by the Irish playwright Bernard Shaw, who insisted on calling the event the starvation. In his words, "When a country is full of food and exporting it, there can be no famine." The landowning class came to be known as the Protestant ascendancy, and it's against them that the bulk of frustrations in Catholic-majority Ireland were directed in the late 1800s. And it was to the Protestant ascendancy that William Butler Yeats himself was born in 1865. Right away, I'd be remiss not to mention the internal struggle that Yeats must have felt as a young man in the turbulent political climate of Ireland. Around this time, Ireland is beginning to entertain notions of home rule, or self-governance, and the Irish Catholic majority becomes a vocal supporter of this movement. But there was still a great deal of animosity and distrust directed towards Anglo-Irishmen like Yeats, especially in regard to the question of their loyalty. For his part, Yeats identified proudly with his Anglo-Protestant base, which he called one of the great stocks of Europe, but he did so in a time when power was receding away from the landowning Protestant aristocracy. This is not to say, however, that Yeats would grow to be unsympathetic to the plight of his fellow Irishmen, for a great revolution was occurring in Ireland at the time, and Yeats would find himself in the middle of it. Largely at the insistence of Charles Parnell in the 1870s and 80s, the Home Rule issue gets pushed in Parliament, and though it's unsuccessful, it gains enough traction in Ireland to plant the seeds for further attempts. Some momentum is gained in the 1910s when Parliament seems receptive, or perhaps acquiescent, to the Home Rule issue. They passed the Home Rule Act in 1914, which would grant Ireland political autonomy and the right to self-governance, but progress is stalled by the outbreak of World War I, and the issue gets swept aside. Ireland is not satisfied with this outcome. Seeing the prize so close within reach, but denied once again, the revolutionary fervor begins to boil within Ireland as tensions rise and culminate in the Easter Rebellion of 1916 that leaves 485 dead in the city of Dublin. Though many factors precipitated the event, some of which we've covered, the Irish Republican Brotherhood were responsible for organizing the uprising, and the militant arm of the movement, the Irish Volunteer Army, was also involved. And from this point until the establishment of the Irish Free State, the face of the Irish independence movement would largely be typified by its militant rather than its diplomatic element. Armed scuffles become more common with every broken promise in Parliament, and Irish nationalism becomes violently intolerant to British doublespeak. After the Easter Rebellion, the leaders of the movement were tried and executed, and Yeats memorializes their sacrifice in the poem Easter 1916, lamenting their excess of love for a cause that cost their lives, at the same time affirming that nothing can ever go back to the way it was. Was it needless death, after all? For England may keep faith, for all that is done and said. We know their dream, enough to know that they dreamed and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse. Macdonough and McBride, and Connolly and Pierce, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. As the poem shows, Yeats had a special place within this complicated mesh of political infighting. At this point, we'll abandon the notion that Yeats held some unsettled loyalties to his Anglo-Protestant heritage. Too much of his poetry assures us that he was first and foremost a proud Irishman who, despite all the qualifications that followed the word Irishman, was an ardent supporter of Ireland. Despite this, Yeats had no tolerance for the militant brand of nationalism that was cropping up throughout Ireland in the early 20th century. He supported the idea of home rule, of self-governance, but believed that self-governance attained through violent revolution would lead only to a change in the roles between the oppressor and the oppressed, but no change in the actual quality of life at home. He summarizes this in his poem, The Great Day. Hurrah for revolution and more cannon shot! A beggar upon horseback lashes a beggar on foot. Hurrah for revolution and cannon come again! The beggars have changed places, but the lash goes on. To understand this, we have to put this in context to the other events going on in Europe at the time. Europe in the aftermath of World War I was rich with the spirit of revolution. In October, the Bolsheviks toppled Russia's Tsarist regime, and similar upheavals were brewing throughout the continent. Yeats would have seen some similarities in the populist rebellion occurring in Ireland, and this did not sit well with him. He wrote the poem The Second Coming as a general warning about the trouble he saw developing in Europe and elsewhere in the world. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. I think the idea has been confirmed by history many times over. Bloody revolutions headed by charismatic leaders who are full of passionate intensity, while the world's best, the thinker, the artist, lack conviction and sit by and let these leaders run amok. Certainly this would have been the image imprinted into Yeats's mind following the Easter Rebellion. While he views those leaders as martyrs, people who, as he writes in Easter 1916, resigned their part in the casual comedy, he stopped short of supporting their tactics. And this put him at odds with people who were close to him, in particular Maud Gonne, a love interest who rejected Yeats because of his refusal to commit to the cause. Yeats would have viewed the revolution with some degree of bitterness. It had stolen the lives of so many of his friends, and now it had turned his own muse against him. Though Yeats tried to disassociate himself from the nationalist agenda, it wasn't long before he was drawn back into the political sphere. After a grueling road to self-governance, the Irish Free State was formed in 1921, officially establishing Ireland as an autonomous dominion with its own parliament and constitution. Yeats was invited to take a seat in the newly formed Sinn Féin, and as a senator, Yeats championed his Anglo-Irish heritage and defended the rights of the Protestant minority on matters of divorce and the separation of church and state. Around this time, Yeats also wins the Nobel Prize for Literature, cementing him as Ireland's foremost literary celebrity. It was ultimately his ties to the Irish dream that won Yeats the title of the de facto voice of Irish culture. His writings would go on to inspire a wide assortment of poets from Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot to Seamus Heaney. But for Yeats, the Irish dream meant something rather different from what it meant to the MacDonaghs and McBrides of Easter 1916. Yeats's ideal vision of Ireland was the peaceful hamlet where the fisherman could sit at the bubbling stream and cast his lure without worry, where people are not divided on political lines, where the artist is valued and uplifted. Yeats's ideal vision of Ireland perhaps could be summarized by the pastoral images seen in his poem Lake Isle of Innisfree. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there, of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings. There midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore. While I stand on the roadway, or on the pavement's gray, I hear it in the deep heart's core. What Yeats conjures up here is an imagined pastoral paradise, Ireland in its fullest embrace of nature, something pure and superior to the actual political reality of a country mired in conflict and bloodshed. As it is often the case with poets, when the actual lives we live are difficult to bear, when we can find no happy alternative, we'll invent one to put our troubled souls at ease. This, I imagine, has always been at the center of the artist's need to create. So instead of seeing Yeats as a strictly political figure, we see him as, above all, a poet who, by a set of circumstances completely beyond his control, found himself steeped in the politics of his era. But this is the whole point of Easter 1916, isn't it? That the MacDonoughs, McBrides, Connollys, and Pierces of the world were not born to lead a rebellion. They simply stepped up to the needs of the state, all unified by a common purpose to give Ireland back to the people. And this, I believe, is what Yeats tried to accomplish through his verse, sometimes butting heads with his contemporaries, but never compromising his personal feelings on making Ireland first. And that'll about do it for this week's presentation.